Secretary, it's such an honour to have you here, and I think we should dive straight in with the first question. Now, across the world, we are seeing a wave of populism, anti-trade sentiment, and a turning inward of nations. One important example has been right here in the UK with the Brexit vote. What is your view on the causes of it, and what should policymakers be doing to respond?
First, thank you, Noah, for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's great to be at the Oxford Union. It's really one of the places in the world that lively debate is still a passion. And it's something that I think is important, because when you see positions on one or another side of an issue joined in a meaningful and respectful way, it actually helps advance civil discourse, which is something that we so badly need in so many parts of the world. On the question that you asked, Noah, the rise of populism is a challenge in so many parts of the world right now. Clearly it was an issue in the vote here on the decision on whether or not to remain part of the European Union. It's clearly part of the elections taking place in the United States this year, and you look around Europe, it's part of the elections in so many countries in Europe. On the one hand, I think if you look at the history of populism in recent decades, we have pretty good evidence that it hasn't worked so well. In the Western Hemisphere, we look at Latin America, where there were some pretty extended experiments in populism in countries like Argentina and Venezuela, and it hasn't worked. But I think the question about what's driving people towards populism, I think it's important to separate what is the anxiety and the anger and what is the solution. Because I think, in fact, there can be something very correct in the diagnosis of a problem, while there's still something very, very wrong about the answer. I think that in the United States, and I would hazard to say I think this is true here in the vote on Brexit, there is a set of anxieties that flows from the way the modern economy has evolved that is looking for a solution. And it's not just one source. You have to look at what technological change has done, globalization, the changing way in which people lead their lives and structure their careers. I think in the United States, what people are looking for is what they most value, which is the opportunity to both have a pathway towards success and to see that their children have a pathway towards success. So in the United States, I don't think that it is we don't have a history where it's tear down the guy at the top. We have a history of everybody should have an opportunity. And you look at the way the modern economy has evolved, people are beginning to question that proposition. Now, when people question that proposition, they lash out. Historically, one of the places that people lash out is against outsiders. And I don't think it's a surprise to see that when people are anxious, they lash out on issues like immigration. The answer is not to put up borders that are impermeable and to isolate economies and countries from each other, but it's also not to ignore the anxiety. So in the United States, I look at where we were 8 years ago. We had an economy that was collapsed. Every day you saw economic reports that were more and more terrifying. We actually acted pretty effectively to turn that economy around. We put a floor underneath the recession, stabilized things, and started to build up from there. We did it by using aggressive fiscal policy. We actually put more fiscal ammunition to work than President Roosevelt did during the New Deal. We had a very new and aggressive monetary policy, and we totally rebuilt our financial system to make sure that the problems that caused the financial crisis and the recession that followed were not going to be the risks of the future, and that we would keep looking at how to make sure new risks didn't develop. We started to grow from there, and you could say, well, why don't people feel better? We've created 15 million new jobs in the private sector. We've seen consumer demand remain strong. I think that what people are worried about is they are looking at an economy that increasingly seems lopsided. They see a tax system where you go to work in the United States and you pay a payroll tax on every dollar you earn. But you look at the business tax system, and on the international side, you see large multinational firms organizing themselves to avoid paying, in some cases, any taxes. And you see very wealthy individuals amass enormous amounts of assets which appreciate in value over a lifetime, and that increase in value may never go taxed. Now, the solutions to the anxiety that people have, I don't think it's rocket science what we need to do in the United States. And I suspect if I were looking at the British system, I would have a similar simple set of solutions. We need to invest more in people. We need people to come out of high school with the skills you need to get, if it's a technical training or a career training, the skills you need to get a job in the economy of the future. We have roughly 3.5 million jobs in the United States that are unfilled, and roughly 3.5 million people looking for work, which means we have a mismatch. Well, that's not something you can fix overnight, but you put the resources into it, you can fix it. We know that we can fix our tax code. We can reform our business tax code so we stop pushing companies overseas to take earnings out of the US tax system, something that hasn't been so popular in Europe, and it's not very popular in the United States. And we could actually use the revenue that comes from doing that to invest in something that we badly need in our country, building infrastructure. Building infrastructure does three things at the same time. First, people don't really like to spend an extra 2 hours a day stuck in traffic. It's not good for your life. It's not good for your economics. Secondly, it builds a foundation for economic growth for the future. You can't grow an economy on a crumbling infrastructure. And not incidentally, it creates good jobs when you're building infrastructure, which is not alone enough of a reason to always build more, but it's a nice benefit when you invest in infrastructure. And this is a time when, even in economies that have a lot of debt, you can afford to spend on infrastructure. It's different to invest in the future than it is to spend in current terms. I think if I look to the bright side in the US, we had a report come out about a month ago which showed that median income in the United States actually grew more in the 2015 calendar year than any time since that series has been kept. We hadn't seen wage growth in the middle of the wage scale like that during this recovery. And it's not an accident. It means the economy is kicking into gear and there's a little more competition for wages. But we've also taken a lot of policy actions to try and address some of the inequality in our system. As part of our economic recovery, we increased benefits that go to families that are low income in terms of getting tax credits, both when they go to work and when they have children. We had a period of relief from payroll taxes so that people got some more money in their pocket. Those are the kinds of tools that I encourage other countries to use when they look at how to grow demand in their country. It's again, not rocket science. If you have weak demand, which is unfortunately one of the characteristics of the global economy now, when you take consumers who have inadequate resources to meet all of their needs, you increase their spending power, demand goes up. You can't do it without limit. You have to focus on medium and long-term fiscal targets that work. But we're at a point in the global economy, and I think I can safely say this, the US economy, where if we don't look at questions like this and balance the tension between short-term investment in people, short-term investment in long-term infrastructure needs, fiscal goals that we may have a little bit more time to meet, if we don't strike the balance right, we run the real risk that middle-class, working-class people say, I see the economy is growing, but I don't see how I'm going to benefit from it. The danger, if that is where things drift to, is not just a short-term political one. I actually think it's a fundamental threat to liberal democracy and to free market capitalism. I believe that liberal democracy and free market capitalism are the best, most effective way of growing an economy and sharing the benefits of both freedom and economic wealth. But it has to work, and it has to work by government playing the role that government has played traditionally to fix problems that don't get fixed on their own because they're not internal to the way free markets work. So you look at the challenge of dealing with a broad public health issue, whether it's a disease or the results of global climate change. That will never be internalized into a firm's decision. That requires government stepping into the breach, making sensible policy both within a country and across boundaries. Now, what's the least common denominator about a lot of the things that I said? The solutions are many. I think the move towards populism would be abated if we were to make progress on the kinds of things that I've just described. But our political systems have tended not to be working as well as they should. Certainly that's our feeling in the United States. We've gotten a lot done over the last 8 years, but there's a lot we haven't been able to do. I hope that coming out of this year, where we've seen the risks that come with not addressing legitimate concerns, and what I would hope would be a broad desire for constructive solutions as opposed to negative solutions, we'll start to see a process of addressing these policy issues in a more direct and effective way. I'm an optimist. I think to be in the business of public policy, you have to be an optimist because conventional wisdom always says anything important is too hard to do. So anything that you take on that is really worth doing is to take on something against the odds. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to address the concerns that working people have and not to have the only answer be put up barriers. Putting up barriers does one thing for sure. It shrinks overall economic growth. Whether it's a trade barrier or an immigration barrier, we know from basic economics that the macroeconomic potential will go down when you put up those kinds of barriers. We have to convince people that we have within our systems a real commitment to spreading the benefits of growth so we don't end up with solutions that end up ultimately being anti-growth.
So you mentioned a failure to address legitimate concerns, which makes for quite a passive error on the part of governments. But do you think there's anything actively that governments have got wrong across the world that have planted so many of these anxieties? And how can we learn from that?
So, the policies that are in place are all policies that have been made. So the one answer is every policy that's in place was an active decision. I think the law of unintended consequences is a powerful force. You look at our tax code in the United States. Most of the things that are now making it inefficient were put in place for a reason that somebody thought was a good idea. The net result is a system that doesn't raise enough revenue, that has loopholes and deductions that are hard to justify, and has tax rates on the business side that are so high that it's driving businesses to leave the United States to avoid taxes, which is a real problem. Going back and fixing that should be easy. But one of the challenges you have in a well-developed system is if I made a list of the 10 worst loopholes, I can also show you 10 strong interests that believe that it's a matter of life and death to protect each one of those, even though it's not in the common interest. What you need to do is have a willingness on the part of policymakers and lawmakers to say, we're going to take the criticism from those who are most directly affected when you do something like closing a loophole, and make a series of decisions that are in everyone's best interest and in the overall economy's best interest. And things that are in the general interest don't have the same concentrated voices calling for change as protectors of things, So, I look, for example, at the action taken in the European Commission putting, in the name of state aid, penalties on companies that got what the European Commission determined to be unfair tax advantages. Now, I actually share the concern that the European Commission has that companies should not be able to avoid taxation by structuring their businesses in countries with very low tax rates. On the other hand, I very much disagree that any governing authority, whether it's Europe or otherwise, should be able to reach into a US tax base, tax income that should be taxed in the United States, and we need to fix that. So there's two things going on here, both of which are policies that were made that need to be reversed. The United States needs to fix its tax code, to lower its business tax rate, get rid of all the loopholes and deductions so we don't lose revenue while we're doing that. But also European countries have to look at their tax rates, many of which are so low that they are attracting that kind of behavior. High tax rates are pushing money overseas, low tax rates are pulling it. Now, that also requires cooperation. You have to be able to talk across international jurisdictions to be able to drive a consensus towards a more normal level of taxation. So why do I pick this example? I think that if we were able to accomplish what I just described, in the United States, it would diminish the sense that the system is not on the level. And one of the things driving the anxiety and the anger is the sense that there are different rules for people and companies that are very successful than for normal people. I think that's important both in terms of the tax policy, but also the social policy of sending the message that the system is on the level. In Europe, I think it's a big issue, the idea that large multinational companies avoid taxation. I'm not sure that it's because there's a desire to bring that revenue into Europe, but there is a desire not to have those companies go untaxed. It's a source of tension now between the United States and Europe. So if you do the right thing, and that's one of many possible examples, I think it actually would help you to chip away at some of this distrust that I think is driving populism both in the United States and in Europe.
Okay, so if we move briefly away from populism and tax code and talk about what you've been doing over the last few days, because just a few days ago you were in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia meeting with finance ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And what I want to know is, should the human rights abuses committed by some of the Council's member states preclude American trade, or worse, warrant sanctions? And should the same apply to China?
We have taken strong positions on many human rights issues around the world, and I'm very proud of our record standing up for human rights. I think that the relationships we have in the Gulf are important at many levels. They're important at a strategic level, they're important at an economic level. They're also important as a driver to keep those countries on a reform path. I mean, I had conversations with colleagues in Gulf countries about how you reform the systems, their economies, to bring women into the workforce, to change very long-held practices. I think there's multiple ways of driving change. I don't think cutting the United States off from countries in a region because we have different histories and different cultures is necessarily the best way to drive change. But it's also important to be very much engaged in the discussion of what kind of change is needed. There are often, and we've seen, cases that become so extreme that they require a response. But I don't think that the only answer we have to try and be an agent of change is sanctions. We run many sanctions programs out of the Treasury Department. We run human rights sanctions programs against human rights violations. We run programs that are against support for terrorism and the like. I think sanctions have been very effective to drive change. For example, I believe sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table, and I don't think there would have been an agreement for Iran to just roll back its nuclear program, but for sanctions. But we can't use sanctions for every situation in the world that requires change or reform. We have to have multiple ways of trying to drive change.
Sure, and the other stop point in this 6-day trip has been Israel, and you met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Finance Minister Moshe Kalon over the last few days. And this follows a new military deal between Israel and America, signed in September, worth a total of $38 billion over 10 years as of 2019. How is this deal politically and fiscally responsible for the United States?
So this is taking a level of support that is consistent with the level of support that we're providing and the trajectory of that support, and it's locking it in a 10-year memorandum of understanding. It's a tradition of how we have structured our aid to Israel that began in the 90s, and I was involved from a different vantage point in the conversations then. I think what it provides is certainty in an area where there's a known need for continued investment in particularly defense and security. and a way of taking a very important relationship between the United States and the one democracy in the region, and a country with whom we share so much in terms of values and history, and saying we're going to take the level of support that we expect to be providing, but do it in a way that adds extra value by providing certainty. I must say that when I was in Israel, there are some who criticized it as being not enough support. But from the experts, what I heard was the certainty was more important than a number a little bit more than it might have been in the memorandum. I think it reflects what is an ongoing relationship that is very important to the United States.
And is it not at all undermined then by the fact that at the meetings you were in with the Gulf nations, Qatar were at that table, and Qatar have been demonstrated to be funding groups like Hamas over the summer? I'm wondering how you managed to balance those tensions.
So we engage with the countries in the Gulf on terrorist financing on a very regular basis. I would say that at the moment we are getting better cooperation from some of the countries in the Gulf on fighting terrorist financing than we are from some countries in Europe. We work very closely with governments like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and with countries like Kuwait and Qatar. They don't all have the same level of visibility into their financial systems. They don't all have the same willingness to take action. But we have found that by continued engagement and by a common interest in making sure that terrorists who could undermine security in their countries as well as more broadly don't have financial resources, we're actually getting substantial cooperation in anti-terrorist financing in the Gulf now.
Okay, and let's take it away from the Middle East. I'm going to ask you one more question before we bring the audience in. I mean, it's a more personal question, but it relates to, I think, what you were talking about, public confidence and a lopsided economy. So Citigroup, where you worked as COO after leaving public office, working in the Clinton administration, was bailed out for $45 billion after losing 90% of its worth during the economic crash of 2008. Do you think your credibility as a public servant is at all undermined by your association with that company?
You know, I actually think that my credibility as a public servant is measured by my 25 years of public service and the work that I've done. I think that the record that I've established in every role that I've had has shown that, and this is something I believe deeply, when you're making public policy, you have to avail yourself of all the facts, the best analysis, the best advice, and make the best decision in the public interest. And in the area of financial reform, when I became Treasury Secretary in 2013, we'd enacted a law to make financial reform happen, but we hadn't implemented many pieces of it. We have had to drive very hard to implement our Dodd-Frank Wall Street financial reforms. We've done it over the objections of many in the financial industry who thought that some of the provisions were too onerous. I have to say that in the week after the British referendum, I spoke to the heads of almost every major financial institution just to get their assessment of the economic impact. And I didn't talk to anyone who was sorry that they had more capital. I didn't talk to anyone who was sorry that we had better clarity of what was going on inside all those institutions, or that we had better plans of what to do if we ever hit a bump in the road. I'm very proud of the work we've done in financial reform. I only hope that the fact that we've been able to withstand shocks like the referendum here in the UK doesn't lead to a false sense of complacency that we've finished the job. There are many problems that we are just beginning to understand in terms of the challenges of the future. The real lesson of the financial crisis in terms of how we go forward is not just to do the things to address what caused the 2008 financial crisis, but to look ahead at what are the risks in the decades to come. And that's going to come from the new developments in how financial transactions are done, the new way investments are managed, the increasing role of automated trading and computer trading, things that didn't exist in a meaningful way when many of the laws that we have in place now were written. I don't know the answers to all those. We have very smart people working very hard trying to stay ahead of the curve. I worry that the fact that we're now close to a decade out from the financial crisis will lead some to say, oh, this is too much government regulation. We'd have so much more economic activity if we just left that field to be less encumbered by requirements. We certainly shouldn't put in requirements that don't make sense. And if we have rules that turn out to have outlived their usefulness, we should be willing to withdraw them. But we should never take our eye off the ball in terms of asking, what is the threat of the future? Is there something we need more information about? Is there more action we need to take? And I have to tell you, the debate I hear is one where it's an open question as to where that will go 2 years, 5 years out. False complacency is actually the thing I worry about.
Thanks. If you have a question for the Secretary, please put your hand high in the air and wait for the microphone to come your way in order that it's picked up by the recording. Could we firstly go to the gentleman in the third row back?
Mr. Secretary, my name is Jonathan Padilla from California. I served in the Obama White House in communications in 2010. My question, now that the administration is coming to an end, you've served such a large part of that administration. What is your proudest accomplishment over the last 8 years of the Obama presidency?
You know, it's very hard after 8 years working on more things than I can count to say one individual thing that I'd be most proud of. I think collectively, in terms of the work that I've done, you look at where the economy was 8 years ago, where it is now, what that means in terms of the current and future lives of so many millions of people in the United States and around the world. Having an economy that is in a stable, growing, and healthy condition versus an economy that was headed towards a depression, you can't have a more striking difference. There's not one thing that led to that. It was a series, as I mentioned earlier, of efforts that we took on almost every policy front to rebuild the foundation for growth and drive growth forward. It was a willingness to go back and do more when we needed on a few occasions to do more. If I were to flip it and say kind of one thing, you know, I often ask myself, and I don't mean this as false humility, what would have just not happened but for what we did? Most things have a momentum of their own, and you affect it on the margins. There's some things that I can just say wouldn't have happened if we hadn't put a spotlight on them and if we hadn't done the work to make something come about. I'll give you an example. We passed legislation in the United States just a few months ago to provide for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico to have a pathway back to economic health. People said it was impossible. Congress wasn't paying any attention to it. And because people in our department cared about it, because I cared about it, we kept the attention on it, we drove the issue forward. And it's a reminder that when you serve in a position like mine, it's not just dealing with the global issues or the national issues. When something is a problem that needs to be addressed or a wrong that needs to be righted, you have a bully pulpit. It's not just the legislative authority you have, but you have the ability to drive an issue to be addressed. And I could use other examples, but that one is probably, in some ways, the easiest to convey that idea.
Thanks. Next question, please. If you go to the hand right at the back, in the red shirt.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. I used to work in private banking for a while, and I was interested because there hasn't been much change in the exchange of fiscal information between countries, but actually right now there's been a lot of change, and most of it is being driven by the US and the FATCA agreement. So I was wondering, how are you bringing countries such as British Virgin Islands, Channel Islands, Panama, and other like fiscal jurisprudences into cooperation in areas where they actually sort of are living by the fact that they have very opaque fiscal systems, that people are actually able to pay way less tax in these sort of institutions. How are you getting countries such as Switzerland to sign FATCA agreements, etc.?
There's kind of several levels there. The first level is FATCA is a tax information sharing regime that began as a U.S. law. It's now become an international standard. And we're seeing tax authorities and law enforcement authorities start to exchange information so that if you're in jurisdiction A and I'm in jurisdiction B and someone is moving money back and forth between the places, we can match it up and see that they should be subjected to tax in one of the two places. We're entering into agreements for information sharing. We actually have to pass a piece of law in the United States to make sure that we can provide reciprocal information more easily, and we're working on that. But that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is something called beneficial ownership. It's not always clear who owns either a property or an asset. And we've taken action in the United States through the Treasury Department administratively to try to create more transparency on when you open a banking account, who the beneficial owner is. We don't have the authority to require that same transparency for all corporations that are formed. That would actually require legislation. We've proposed legislation to do that. But I think by dealing with both the transparency on beneficial ownership and the exchange of information where there are proper agreements, we're making progress on this front. Now, you have to balance things like exchange of information with very real concerns about personal privacy. So there's been a debate over the last few years where, frankly, some in Europe advocated making public a lot of this information. I don't believe that personal information should be broadcast publicly for private individuals and entities, because to me that's a violation of privacy. I think it's very different for a tax and a law enforcement authority to be able to share with another trusted tax and law enforcement authority information to be able to find people who are evading the system. Another thing to publish in newspapers lists of information that is not typically public information. Certainly in the United States, tax information is highly protected. It's so protected that as Treasury Secretary, it's against the law for me to get private individual tax information. So it's a very deeply held concern about individual privacy. We've actually, over the last few years, worked our way through disagreements in that area to make real progress in the G20 and in the OECD. And I think that this is an area, going to your first question, Noah, about populism, some of the distrust comes from the idea that there's ways to, even legally, avoid having your activities subject to normal taxation because of the way the system has evolved internationally over the years. The more successful we are at taking away that sense of unfairness, the more we put resources into dealing with the real problems people have in terms of having economic opportunity, the less pressure there will be for solutions like populism.
Thanks. Next question, please. Should we go to the gentleman who I'm pointing at? Yeah.
Thank you, Secretary. My question is in response to what you said in answer to the first question around the challenges, the twin challenges of growing demand as well as figuring out a way for government to help people who feel like they're left out. And I wanted to hear your thoughts, what you think about the prospect of a policy like universal basic income, as well as what that might look like in a place like the United States or other welfare democracies across the world.
The idea of a universal income has been discussed for decades in different forms, and in some ways we've taken pieces of what a universal income is about and incorporated it into other policies. So we have something called the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States. That means people who earn a low income actually get a check from the government instead of paying taxes to the government because we're trying to make the value of work support a minimal standard of living. I think that if we could change our minimum wage laws so that we raised incomes at the bottom level, creating a little bit of pressure at the top, You know, as somebody who grew up professionally in the 70s and the 80s when hyperinflation was a big concern, I probably didn't in those days ever think I'd be saying this. We can afford a little bit of inflation now. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we saw pressure on wages so that we start seeing a natural process of having that happen. I think that, you know, when we passed the Affordable Care Act in the United States, a big part of it was providing subsidies to people to make sure that we could close the coverage gap, particularly for people who couldn't afford health insurance, by making sure that there was a supplement to do that. So while it is not a single policy of saying there's a minimum income everyone should have, if you look at what the interaction of those kinds of policies are, it actually does say that everyone who works ought to be able to be living above the poverty line. Everybody ought to be able to have health insurance that they can afford. And when you look at the median income statistics that I cited, we're actually seeing some progress. It is not, you know, what I was saying earlier about the threat to kind of the core values of liberal democracy. Democracy is not about everyone being treated the same, and it's not about everyone agreeing, but it is about the compact between all of us to be part of the same system and ultimately trusting the decisions made in that system. The kind of concern I have is that if we're not seen to be addressing that, it is going to continue to feed the sense that the economy only works for part of the public, which is threatening, I think, to that broad acceptance of the legitimacy of what we do. We can't guarantee outcomes. We can't guarantee that every individual will have the same income, will have the same performance in what they do, but we can guarantee that everyone has access to certain minimum things, like the kind of education that gives you the tools to succeed in one or another way. That's on us if we don't do it. That's not because other people have not, that's not because people don't want an education. And it's not all the federal government. Some of it is in the United States is a state and local issue. But it is a challenge for governance generally that we have to be able to deliver the essential things. So it's not a direct answer on should there be a single national income. I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan suggested it in the United States 40 years ago. I'm sure it will be debated you know, in one form or another. But I think the kinds of policies I've described actually address the concerns that are at issue, if not the direct policy.
I just want to pick up very briefly on one thing, because populism does seem to be a theme running through everything we're talking about. And I'm curious as to how you differentiate between populism and democracy, because in what way is the Brexit vote, let's say, a populist decision as opposed to simply a democratic one? And you could say the same thing about Trump support.
So I think there's a lot of different definitions of populism, but I think that the idea that there are problems that require intervention is what I would define as a basis for kind of liberal democracy. Free markets don't solve every problem. They just don't. We didn't have safe cars until we had car safety standards. We didn't have safe working conditions until we had fair labor standards laws. We didn't have a solution to air pollution in our country, in the United States, until we had a Clean Air Act. We're not going to see the global climate change issue addressed unless we implement the Paris Agreement and take the steps necessary, which thankfully we're doing. There's a lot that needs, a lot of the need for government to play an active role solving problems. I think that the idea that everything big is bad, the idea that that the system can't work for working people and you have to do things, you know, on a kind of class basis to right wrongs, I think that's different. I think you can you can look at the Brexit vote, say, as a rejection of kind of traditional expert advice and an adoption of a political idea that most experts say is wrong. Now, I think policy ought to be made based on facts, based on careful analysis, and based on working out differences through honorable compromise. If you could get all of the major policy decisions to a place where you had fact-driven, analytic compromise, I wouldn't be happy with every outcome. I wouldn't be happy with every solution, but we would have better decisions that could last and drive our country and our collective countries in the right direction. I fear that there's a growing distrust of authorities in general, and the alternative to relying on expert analysis is making decisions more emotionally. And that worries me because if you're not addressing things in a way that you look at trade, I think that it is clear that that there is a better environment for broad macroeconomic growth when we have freer trade. I think if you look at the global economy since the end of World War II, there's no question but that the Bretton Woods system has done more to alleviate poverty around the world, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and notwithstanding all the problems we face in the world, build a foundation for a more stable world than if we hadn't had it. I think there's a distrust of things that are driven by complicated macroeconomic theories because of the question of within our systems, how do you make things work so that a kid growing up in the schools today has better opportunities in the future. In the United States, some of it is a kind of nostalgia for something that may never have been exactly what people remember. People remember the United States of the 1950s. And I grew up in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It was the era after World War II when you couldn't buy things that were made in a lot of countries because they weren't producing a lot of things. We were providing massive amounts of aid to countries, and then they were buying things from the United States. That was not a permanent world condition. That was the 20 years after a world war that ended with the only functioning economy being the US economy. We succeeded. We built a stronger global economy. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that's happened under that system is right. There's been unfair practices, unfair trade practices. We have been very demanding critics of unfair practices. I engage directly with many of my counterparts saying, you can't expect to have the kind of access you want to our markets if you do X, Y, or Z. But I wouldn't trade the system for another. We have to make it work, and we have to engage to always improve it, and we have improved it. So you take something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP in the United States. It is a trade agreement that does more to address the concerns that many people have, people who would call themselves progressives. It sets higher labor standards than have ever come out of a trade agreement, higher environmental standards, better business practices. We are actually seeing countries in the TPP group enact changes in their labor laws to strengthen their labor laws, even in anticipation of the agreement going into effect. So I think in an objective analysis, it's growing the economies and it's driving change in the right direction. So why do we have trouble convincing people that it's a good thing to do? I still think we can get it done in the remaining months of the Obama administration. We're going to make a full court press in the lame duck session. We're having a problem because of this underlying anxiety. It's a number of things. If there's not a TPP, it won't take technology out of the workplace. If there's not a TPP, it won't end globalization. But if there's not a TPP, it means the United States will have that much less access to a growing part of the global economy, and there'll be less pressure on those countries to meet high standards, which is bad in terms of their competitiveness. They'll be more competitive with lower labor standards, and bad in terms of the outcome. It's not a better world if you have lower labor standards. It's a better world if you have higher labor standards. So I think that the case has to be made for these kinds of issues. Something I've devoted a fair amount of time to in this year, which is my last year as secretary, is making a public case on these things. And I'll take some of the blame for this, we sometimes take for granted that everyone understands the benefits that come from these kinds of policies. I think that's probably a mistake, because it's not obvious to people who are working in a day-to-day job that isn't about international trade. They're working at a company. They're not thinking about how much of what they're doing wouldn't be done if they didn't have markets internationally, if the people who bought their things didn't have markets internationally. We have to make that case. We also have to make the case for standards, that it really matters, and I've certainly done that. And we also have to remind people that their quality of life is higher when they can afford better clothes and better things that they enjoy every day, and that's because of the efficiency that comes from free trade. It shouldn't be because of unfair trade practices. We have to demonstrate that we're willing to shut down unfair trade practices. So there are a lot of things that we have to do to make the case. But the answer isn't to just say we're going to cut countries off from us or ourselves off from other countries. And if you think about it geopolitically, you think about the vote in the UK, I look at the kind of history of Europe in the last 70 years, and I see a Europe that has been more stable, has grown more, it's hard to find that many decades when there hasn't been tension between countries in Western Europe. It's been a safer, more prosperous Europe with union. So the vote against staying in the vote to leave reflected in some ways a rejection of much of the history. Now I know that there's a lot that one can criticize in any system of governance. I could pick apart our own governance system, I could pick apart the European governance system. But I look at the kind of world at the end of World War II and the world now, and I see a world that's better because we've worked collaboratively to build a stronger future together. I hope we can find a way to make that case compellingly so that it doesn't become a choice where people say, if we work together, somehow that means abandoning some of our own future. I don't think that's what it's meant, and I think the alternative is, as I say, a world that's both less prosperous and less secure. And from the US perspective, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs earlier in the year where I developed this at some length. It has given the US the ability to project its values into many places where alone we wouldn't have been able to. Just in these last few years, our engagement on Ukraine has been heavily supported by the ability to use the IMF as a way to support Ukraine's economy, where it wasn't just the United States, but it was the countries of the world saying Ukraine needs to reform its economy but have a pathway towards stability, and that helps Ukraine resist aggression from Russia. The United States alone could not have written a check for $18 billion to Ukraine. If Ukraine didn't have the support from the IMF and from the United States through things like loan guarantees and from many other countries, if it didn't have that package, it wouldn't be a question of does Russia, kind of take more of Ukraine. It would be a question of does Ukraine just collapse? Does the economy just collapse? Now, I look at something like that and I see enormous US benefit for our involvement in that system. But it took me 5 years to get Congress to approve IMF quota reforms because there's no burning political drive for things like international economic cooperation. It's something we do because it's the right thing, but we also need to make the case to build the support for it. I do take some comfort from the fact that in the days at the end of World War II, my predecessors had the same struggle in creating the Bretton Woods organizations. So it's not a new phenomenon that it's hard to sell things like this. But we can't let international cooperation be somehow defined as something that just benefits large corporations and rich individuals. It's become part of the bedrock of what creates a prosperous and safe world.
Yes. We have time for one more question. I'm seeing lots of men everywhere. Can we go to the second bench on my right here? sort of with the white cuff. Oh yeah, that goes fine.
I can't hear you without the microphone.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned reforming the U.S. corporate tax code so that some of our multinationals wouldn't have as great of an incentive to hold earnings overseas, like Google and Apple, for instance, hold a lot of earnings in Ireland because of a lower tax rate. Do you think that would best be accomplished by simply lowering the corporate tax rate, or is there a more sophisticated policy approach that would avoid some kind of like race to the bottom?
So what we've proposed in the United States is really got multiple levels to it. First, we would lower the general business tax rate, corporate tax rate, by closing loopholes, shutting down credits and deductions, using the revenue that comes from doing that to take our tax rate down to 28%. Now, you've got tax rates at 10 and 12% in some other jurisdictions, so you still have a gap. So I think your point is the point I tried to make earlier, is we have to lower our tax rate, but frankly, we have to resist efforts in many countries to have competitively low tax rates to be a magnet for that kind of activity. We have a separate issue in terms of the international tax system where we've proposed to have a minimum tax imposed on U.S. income that's kept overseas. So whether you bring it back to the United States or not, you pay a minimum tax on it. You'd get a credit for any taxes you paid in a foreign jurisdiction, but you would not be able to avoid your U.S. tax by failing to repatriate the U.S. income. And then the company would be free to do whatever it wanted. It could invest in any country that it wanted. It would have met its tax liability. We have proposed to have a transitional rate for money that historically has already been parked overseas, and that's where we would get substantial one-time revenue, and that substantial one-time revenue could be in the hundreds of billions of dollars depending on where you set the rate. We've proposed to use that revenue to pay for infrastructure. I believe that there's going to be a very strong desire in the United States to deal with infrastructure over the next year. From conversations I've had with Democrats and Republicans, I believe that there is a broad, growing consensus behind the kind of structure that I just described. And I actually think the action by the European Commission has been a wake-up call for many that if we don't deal with this, other people are going to start helping themselves to deal with it, which I'm not advocating or defending, but I have every intention of trying to use the confluence of events to try and draw attention to the fact that we have a solution in the United States. You know, it won't happen in my final 2.5 months, but we've done enough work on it that it's something that if a new administration and a new Congress wanted to deal with this issue, they could do it pretty quickly. And I certainly plan to leave behind whatever work we've done to make it as easy as possible to get done.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Please remain seated whilst our guest departs, but firstly, join me in thanking Secretary Liu for a truly insightful